Hello everybody, we're today here at the Ostwall and this is a 50-ton turret. There's another, or would be another over there. The Soviets destroyed it after the war. And there's a mortar pit, there's a flamethrower, there are observation slits and everything here. And we just went about 1-2 kilometers underground, 30 meters under the ground. And we just covered a small bit of a huge area. Now you probably never heard about the Ostwall. I, for instance, didn't. And when Mirko, who is behind the camera, contacted me a few months ago, I was like, okay, he said, let's check out the Oder-Warthe-Bogen. And I was, the what? And then, yeah, it's usually referred as the Ostwall. And I said, yeah, that's interesting. And then I realized it never really came up. So the question is why we never heard about the Ostwall.
So first off, a bit of clarification, because there are at least 3 different kinds of projects that are called Ostwall. This clearly did not help overall. Still, it was quite interesting to check the index of various books in my library. Most of them didn't have a single entry on Ostwall. The main book that stood out was Mawdsley's Thunder in the East, which had many entries under Ostwall. Yet this was not the Ostwall I was searching for. He was referring to the Panzerwerk line from 1943 on the Eastern Front, which was a defensive line that was partially built. It stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea along the river Dnieper. The Ostwall as a defensive structure was largely a figment of Nazi imagination. The geographical position chosen, however, with supporting river lines and shorter length, made more sense than trying to hold on at the high water mark of conquest. Although it is very important to add here that in this case the name Ostwall is far more fitting than for the Oder-Warta-Arch, which I visited, simply for the reason that in Führerbefehl number 10, the Führer order number 10, the Panzerwerk line was actually called Ostwall. To quote from the execution order of the order, number 1, the following aspects are decisive for the construction of the Ostwall. A. The construction must be pushed forward by all means so that the most important sections of the Ostwall can be defended as early as late autumn of this year. B. A clear, tight and focused concentration of the forces in these sections is necessary. C. A clear command structure in the individual sections must ensure that no competence disputes or frictions between the individual services involved in the deployment lead to a delay in the construction. Note, a Führerbefehl, literally Führer order, was something different than a Weisung, a directive, of which existed around 75 and which are commonly better known and more famous. But anyway, enough about this Ostwall. The second one was an anti-tank ditch system in eastern Prussia, for which I could not find any more information. And finally, the Festungsfront Oder-Warthe-Bogen, or in English, Fortified Front Oder-Warta-Arch, is also called the Ostwall, and this is the Ostwall we are looking for. Its construction started in 1934, so 1 year after the Nazis took power and 5 years before the Second World War started. It should provide a defensive line between the shortest route between Poznan and Berlin. Now this was a major and expensive project. In the Oder-Warta-Arch, the Nischlitz Ober section was developed into a permanent fortification front. It was located so far west of the Reich border that Polish forces could only prepare an attack on this strong fortress front after crossing the border. The large fortifications, literally combat stations, were produced in a strength which protect against continuous fire up to 21 cm caliber against single fire or heavy guns and corresponding bombs. Note that a more recent source indicates that some fortifications should actually be able to withstand a continuous fire by up to 50 cm shells. Now the key elements of the defensive system were the Panzerwerk, literally armored or tank works. These were heavily armored and armed. Most of the Panzerwerk fortifications were self-sufficient. That means they had a generator to produce electricity, had a well in the building, the outside air was filtered or detoxified, and a slight overpressure was generated in the bunker so that warfare agents could not penetrate. In the case of the Panzerwerk fortifications, they were connected to the cavern system in the central section, and the barracks were built at a safe depth, at least 20 meters below the surface. As such, this was an expensive defensive system, and to give you some numbers on the amount of steel used for the individual components. A 6-Schartenturm Typ 36 P8, meaning 6-slit turret, required 110 tons. The turret for the machining Granatwerfer Typ 38P8 required 111 tons. It literally means machine grenade launcher, yet due to a change in terminology, machine mortar launcher is a more correct translation. And finally, the turret for a 10.5 cm gun required 476 tons. Very important here, that is the steel required for the production, not the final weight, which was likely lower. It is also important to point out that this system was not a mere copy of the Maginot Line. There were various differences. One major difference was that the various fortified positions were interconnected with each other underground, with a railway line, whereas in the Maginot Line, major fortifications were not interconnected with each other. Now the construction began in 1934, and in 1935 Hitler decided it should be finished in 15 years, yet in 1936 he reduced it to 10 years and shortly thereafter to 4 years. As such, in some cases it couldn't be finished, especially since resources were shifted to the Westwall, which is usually called the Siegfried Line in English. As you can see, this was a major fortification system the Germans built, so returning to the original question, why you probably never heard about it. So let's look at the main factors. First, generally it was rather small. It had a length of 70 to 90 kilometers depending on the front and how you count, which compared to the Westwall was rather short. The 630 kilometer long fortification zone Westwall represented a deeper positioning system, with about 20 installations per 1 kilometer. Of course, this was even dwarfed by the Atlantic Wall that stretched from Norway down to the Spanish coast, where just the western part of France and the Netherlands together had a frontage of 2,100 kilometers or 1,300 miles. For an in-depth discussion about the problems the Germans faced defending their coast, be sure to check out this video. Now second, the Oder-Warta-Arch received far less attention in the propaganda, which was also due to the fact that after the defeat in Poland, it was not needed anymore until 1945. Yet it's particularly interesting that German citizens during the war asked why there was no equivalent to the Westwall in the east. It is therefore not surprising that the summer of 1943, as the SD, the intelligence agency of the SS, reported, increasingly even nameless members of the people asked themselves why there was no counterpart to the Westwall in the east, at which the waves of attack of Red Army would be smashed by comparatively few of their own defense forces. The third factor is, of course, since quite a lot of our history is focused on the Western Front, we know less about the Eastern Front. Although the Eastern Front saw a majority of the fighting and battles, a lot of major battles like Dubno, also called the Battle of Brody in 1941, or the campaigns at the Rzeszów salient, are sometimes rather unknown. In many cases there exist just a few books, whereas for D-Day, Market Garden or even El Alamein there are dozens or even hundreds of books out there. Fourth, the fortified front Oder-Warta-Arch was, due to its purpose of being a defensive structure against Poland before the war and then the shift toward the west, rather soon neglected, and this continued throughout the war. Which makes a lot of sense, because why care about a fortification line that is hundreds, if not thousands kilometers away from the front line? As such, it was stripped of a lot of equipment and weaponry. Weapons, optical and other non-stationary equipment were dismantled and installed in the bunkers of the Westwall. Later, the last remaining weapons and equipment were removed for the construction of the Atlantic Wall. Of course, in late 1944, early 1945, rearmament was started, but there were complications. Additionally, the Red Army advanced far faster than anticipated. A few days before recon troops of the 1st Guard Tank Army reached the area, construction troops reported that there were serious issues with properly rearming the fortress. The hour of truth for rearmament in the Oder-Warta-Arch struck on January 23, 1945, when the Installation Command East reported that the installation of electrical equipment in 42 slit turrets could not be completed until mid-February 1945 due to a lack of skilled workers. Likewise, due to the lack of skilled workers, the installation of machine mortars and fortress flamethrowers could not be initiated before mid-February 1945. And this leads to the most important aspect, namely that the Oder-Warta-Arch was overcome rather easily by the Red Army in the late war. The semi-official German history of the Second World War puts it rather well. On the 26th January, reconnaissance units of the 1st Guard Tank Army arrived at the fortifications on the East Brandenburg border in the Messeritz area, dating from the 1930s. 4 days later, these fortifications had been broken through. Yet the author notes that the fortification system could have delayed the Red Army probably a bit longer. The fortifications in the Oder-Warta-Arch could have been a significant obstacle for the attacker, even in the unfinished and partly in the meantime gutted state, if they had been occupied by sufficient and trained troops. On January 16, 1945, the General Staff Office of the Messeritz Fortress Service demanded 6 infantry divisions with 2 corps commands, which were not available, for an effective defense of the Tir-Stiegel position ahead of the fortress front. Now if you just assume an infantry division with a strength of about 10,000 men, which was slightly below the authorized strength, this would be around 60,000 men. According to one source, a mere 2,000 German soldiers actually defended the fortifications. As such, the Ostwall is mainly a footnote, although I can highly recommend a visit to these fortifications, since they are in excellent shape and we definitely had a lot of fun there. Well, I hope you learned something new. Thank you to Czeslaw for being a great guide, and to Mirko for supporting me on the trip. As always, sources are linked in the description. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for watching and see you next time.